Okay, let's come to order. Today is the Wednesday, July 16th, 2008, regular meeting of the Glendale Planning Commission. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Hank Sheets.
Here.
Commissioner Gordon Torgerson.
Here.
Commissioner Leonard Manukian.
Here.
Chair William Kane.
Here.
And Commissioner Gary Juro.
All right. Report regarding posting of agenda, please.
The agenda for this meeting was posted on or before Wednesday, July 9th, 2008, on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
All right, thank you. Would you please all join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Approval of minutes. Let's see here. It says the June 4th. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the July 2nd minutes, right? Minutes for July 2nd. Any comments or corrections to the minutes?
I have one minor change.
Sure.
We're after the Pledge of Allegiance in item 3. It has my introduction and has me as Zoning and Parks Commission. It was Parks, Recreation, and Community Services Commission, not to be confused with zoning.
Okay.
Very minor.
Any other corrections or comments? All right, motion, please.
I move with that, with the correction noted, the minutes be approved.
Second.
By motion support, call the roll, please.
Commissioner Sheets.
Aye.
Commissioner Torgerson.
Aye.
Commissioner Manukian.
Aye.
And Chair Kane.
Aye, on a vote of 4-0, the minutes of July 2nd were approved as corrected. Item 5 were all communications. I have no cards. Well, I presume Ms. Collins, you're here for the agendized meeting? Okay. And we have no appeals under agenda item 6, so we'll move to agenda item 7A, Zoning Code Amendment Case PZON 2008-003 related to use variances. Its location is the City of Glendale. The description is a public hearing on the proposed zoning code amendment related to use variances. The applicant's the City of Glendale. Staff is represented by Wolfgang Kraus. Mr. Kraus.
Yes. Mr. Chair, members of the Planning Commission, as you indicated, this is Zoning Code Amendment Case number PZON 2008-003. And this is a proposed ordinance to potentially amend the zoning code in relationship to the use variance process. The Homeowners Coordinating Council some time ago brought to the attention of the City Council during oral communications their desire to actually have the council amend the code to prohibit use variances in the future. So council asked the planning staff to come back with a report on the subject, which we did. And when we did, after some discussion, the city council indicated their preference for 3 options that they wanted us to come back to you to discuss through the formal hearing process. So those options were having use variances considered by the Planning Commission with a supermajority, in other words, 4 votes required for the approval of a use variance, and then with an appeal going to the City Council, and similarly requiring a supermajority or 4 votes to approve a use variance on an appeal. The second option was having the zoning administrator still hear the original case, and then having a direct appeal from the zoning administrator to the City Council, and then if that were the case, a supermajority or 4 votes of council would be necessary to actually approve a variance. And finally, the third option was to have the Planning Commission be the first hearing body for a use variance application, and then the appeal going to City Council, but relying on the current process of only a majority of the Commission and Council needed to approve a use variance. After this, the City Attorney staff, Mr. Garcia, and I got together and pondered whether or not this whole concept of the supermajority was really going to work in a practical manner. And even though we could draft language to indicate what would happen in certain situations, we decided that it really wasn't appropriate in a quasi-judicial situation to end up with a potential denial without any addressing of the findings. Now, this would only happen if there was a majority vote to approve a variance, but not a supermajority. In other words, if you had 5 people, commissioners or council members sitting, and they voted 3-2 to approve it, we could write the code so that that were a de facto denial, but then you wouldn't have any of the findings addressed. So that's the problem. In a quasi-judicial situation, you really are basing your decision on the facts and not some situation where you just, if you don't have the votes, that it's deemed denied. Now, on a zone change, that's a little different matter. That's a legislative decision, and if you don't have the 4 votes, essentially it's status quo. So a little different criteria. So that's why we've only presented you with one draft ordinance, and that's related to the third option. In other words, having the Planning Commission be the initial hearing body, and then appeals going to the City Council. So let's digress a little bit and talk about variances and use variances. As I'm sure you know, the variance process is there to provide relief in unique situations from zoning code requirements. It's expected that not all situations can be addressed by a general code requirement, so the variance process provides a relief valve, again, primarily to deal with unusual, unique situations. 4 required findings are required in order to approve a variance. Now, the state law does address a lot of different planning issues, including variances. And the Homeowners Coordinating Council wanted the city to ban the use of use variances for Glendale, similar to what is in the state law for general law cities. Now, in California, we have general law cities and charter cities. This particular section that prohibits use variances from being approved only deals with general law cities. Glendale, being a charter city, is not subject to this. But I guess the theory is that if this is something that the state thinks is inappropriate for general law cities, then maybe it should be applicable to Glendale as well. Now, there are different types of use variances. It isn't always just the commercial use proposing to go into a residential zone. I've outlined the different situations in the past where we have used the use variance process. So let me quickly read those so that everybody understands. Well, the use variance has been applied for the extension of a larger commercial project into a residential zone. Of course, maybe the front half is in commercial, back half is in residential, so the back half of the project could have been granted a use variance in the past. Approval of minor variations of commercial or industrial uses in commercial and industrial zones. Uses, there's a whole bunch of uses listed for each zone, the permitted uses. And there are different variations and combinations of different types of uses that someone could propose, and occasionally you will have a minor variation that technically does not fit into the zoning category of that particular zone, and so somebody could and has requested a use variance to get approval of that in the past. Also, we have had expansion of legal non-conforming commercial and industrial uses in residential, commercial, and industrial zones. In other words, the code changes or the zone changes, and what you have there is legal non-conforming, and maybe they want to make some changes, maybe a slight expansion, maybe a large expansion that could have been handled by a use variance in the past. expansion of legal nonconforming residential uses in residential zones. For example, you could have a duplex in a single-family zone. So if you wanted to expand that today would be, that could be a use variance application. You could also have change of use in an existing legal nonconforming commercial building in a residential zone. For example, a C1 zone doesn't allow you the kind of flexibility in changing commercial uses that you could have in some other situations. You have to stick to the exact commercial use that was there before. Now, there isn't much of that, but it has existed and does exist in Glendale. So if I wanted to change the commercial use from one kind to another, I could apply for a use variance, and that has been done in the past and has been approved in the past. You could also have approval of uses to be allowed to be continued in a zone where such uses have previously been authorized by a conditional use permit under a former code or by variance that had an expiration period. This is fairly common. For example, a private school in a single-family zoning district used to be a conditional use permit. That was changed many years ago. So if I used to have a conditional use permit in the past that had a time expiration date, if I came back to renew that, I'd have to apply for a variance rather than a conditional use permit. Or if I had a use variance to begin with and the time period were to expire, I'd have to apply for a new use variance. So we've had that in the past. Another example is extensions of small portions of commercial and industrial buildings or parking areas into residential zones where the zone boundary did not follow a property line. There are cases where the property lines are not in a nice straight line, but the zone boundary is. So maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 feet of somebody's property may actually extend over into the residential zone, because the zone boundary was established as a straight line, maybe X number of feet from the right-of-way line or parallel with the majority of the property line, the rear property line. So somebody may want to put the rear few feet of their commercial building in a residential zone, or maybe part of their parking lot in a residential zone. So that's another example of where use variances have been applied in the past. Or the really obvious, you can have a commercial use completely in a residential zone, and that's happened in the past. We've given you some samples of recent cases. So since beginning of 2006, we've had 8 use variance applications that have been granted and 2 denied. We've just provided the original decisions. A couple of those were on appeal. But the decisions, the final decisions were, again, 8 approvals and 2 denials. As indicated in your staff report, that staff believes that the use variances for larger scale projects were more prevalent in the 60s and 70s, and that practice through revisions of the zoning pattern and a few other things, the code, that situation doesn't seem to exist as much today. Now, we did a quick survey of some of the other local charter cities, so we found that Torrance was the only other one that we were able to contact that, similar to Glendale, allows the processing of use variances. Burbank, Pasadena, Santa Monica, and Long Beach do not permit the processing for approval of use variances. Now, it's staff's opinion that the high standard of the findings required for all variances should dictate the end result. So if the applicants are held to the standard to provide the evidence to justify all of the findings, then there should be no concern about use or abuse of the use variance process. Although we do agree in principle, the use variance isn't a very good planning tool, but when used in a minor capacity, it does provide some flexibility in those unique situations. as we indicated to the city council when we brought the report to them, one alternative would be to a complete ban would be to require a supermajority similar to what is required on a zone change. As you know, a zone change does require a 4/5 vote of the city council to enact a zone change. And if there's a 20% protest of the surrounding property owners, the frontage of the property owners, it's a 5/5. It has to be unanimous. So we thought that maybe if we had the same criteria for use variances, it would maybe balance that out. But again, it turns out that that's not really a good approach for a quasi-judicial situation after further research by Mr. Garcia of our city attorney's office. And we certainly concur with that. So we are recommending that you not go in that direction. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with the draft ordinance, which basically takes the zoning administrator out of the process. That would be the only change. Well, I guess an advantage to that is the initial hearing has to be approved. The initial case, the initial decision, if it's going to be approval, has to be approved by more than just one person. In other words, a majority of the planning commission would have to vote on that. But, and then similarly on an appeal to city council. Maybe the downside, though, is that a lot of these cases are minor, and that's really the function of the zoning administrator, that a lot of these cases aren't controversial, and if you're going to have the zoning administrator position at all dealing with variances in general, then it seems appropriate to continue to allow the zoning administrator to handle these cases. So there's pros and cons to both approaches. We did meet with the Homeowners Coordinating Council representatives to discuss this a while ago, and we tossed out the idea. I mean, they understand that part of the problem is these existing cases that have time limits. If you banned use variances altogether, applicants would have to go in a different direction, either apply for a zone change, apply for a code amendment. Some cases they might be granted, some not, but that's not necessarily any different than a use variance. And there's a downside to some of those proposals as well. You could be tempted to create some spot zoning, which is probably worse than granting a use variance in some cases. But what we really didn't get into with council, because they really, there didn't seem to be a majority that wanted to ban use variances, was this idea of continuing to allow those properties that already had an existing use variance to come back and renew it if the time runs out. So if you're interested in that, we can talk a little bit more about the details of that. In other words, we could create another ordinance that council could consider, that you would ban all new use variance applications and only allow essentially renewals of existing cases, for lack of a better word. And if you're pro banning them all together, that's one approach. If you're believe that maybe we should just leave things alone, that the findings sort of take care of themselves, and that's another approach. You can go with the ordinance as drafted, where you would be the initial hearing body, and appeal to council, again, just a regular majority vote to approve it, or go with this other proposal, or whatever combination you'd like. We did something similar, or the city did something similar when we were amending regulations related to billiard establishments and arcade establishments in the past, where they were given a certain amount of time to apply for a conditional use permit if they didn't have one. And it was very complicated, but we have done something similar in the past. Again, if you're interested in that, I'll wait and see if that's the case, and we can talk a little bit more about the details of how that might work. But that's only if you're interested in going in that direction. You may prefer one of the other approaches. So again, I've got the samples So you can see the types of cases that we've approved recently. If you want any more background information on some of the bigger projects, obviously I'm not familiar with all the cases that we've ever processed, but I might be able to help you with something. I don't know whether anybody's going to bring up any specific cases today or not. The written communication that you've gotten from the Homeowners Coordinating Council does reference one of the attached cases. So, I'll let Ms. Collins talk about that, and then we can get into that more as well. So I will stop at this time and ask if you have any questions that I can answer at this time.
All right, I know at least one of the commissioners has some initial questions. Mr. Torgerson?
Can you just clarify for us the difference between a variance for lot size or setback or any other item in the municipal code and a use variance? It seems to me if they both have the same standards, same findings have to be made, a normal variance could be against the code that specifies setback or height or floor area ratio or a permitted use. So why is a use variance different than just a normal variance?
The only reason a use variance is different in Glendale right now is that there's a different fee. Otherwise, the findings are the same. It's just a different label. We call a setback variance a standards variance. But in terms of the way the code is set up, there is no difference.
So let's say if we had no use variances whatsoever, and I had a reason to be able to make a case where the findings could be made, I would just apply for a normal variance against the municipal code section that defined the use for that.
Right. And that's what you do now in Glendale. You just pay a slightly higher fee than you do for a variance requesting anything else.
So the use variance is more expensive now?
It's slightly more expensive, yes. Didn't always used to be that way.
Either, but, yeah.
But yeah, the distinguishing element is in the state code with relationship to general law cities. That's
Right.
where the distinction is.
Now, a general law city, and maybe our attorney can fill in and clarify, but if some little settlement arises in an unincorporated area of the county, for instance, and they decide to call themselves Mayflower, and the little kingdom of Mayflower doesn't have a charter or any kind of official organization, and they're the ones that are considered a general...
Right. Unless the voters approve a charter, they're a general law city.
So basically, it's in the absence of voters getting together and approving a charter for their city, the Sacramento decides, well, you guys got to have some sort of laws, so we have a general set of guidelines or
Right.
general use laws.
Well,
One of which says no use permits.
Right.
But then it's perfectly okay for small cities that have a charter, if they want to run their own show, they can do whatever they want.
Right. Now, state land use law isn't consistent. It's not that everything only applies to general law cities. Some things specifically apply to everything. If they say it does, then it does. You know, you've got the different sections in the code, and
State code.
It's not consistent, let's just say that. Some things apply to general law cities and charter cities, some things only to general law cities. This is in a section that applies only to general law cities unless it says otherwise, and this doesn't say that, so it doesn't apply to Glendale and Burbank and
So
Long Beach.
Sacramento's assuming if you have a charter and, local adult supervision, you don't have to, you can bypass that.
I'm not sure you can read too much into that, because, again, sometimes you have the votes to make it apply to all, you just have to write it that way. You just have to have the votes in Sacramento to say that in the government code, and then it is so.
In other words, there's no reading into the rationale or reason why that ended up in the code, because half these things are this thick when they vote on them and nobody reads them anyway.
I can't give you a reason. I mean, the fact that is even in the code probably means that there was a situation back when this was adopted that prompted somebody to gather the forces and lobby Sacramento to adopt something like this. It probably wasn't a result of an effort to provide for good planning. It was a case or one or two cases that people thought were pretty bad planning, managed to convince the legislature that these should be banned in the future.
Mr. Hagani, apparently there's some questions from your desk or statements.
Ms. Lucy Varpetian, who is representing the city attorney's office, actually has some comments to make about this.
I just wanted to maybe shed some light on the difference between a general law city and a charter city. Predominantly, the difference is that if the state law does not preempt a particular area of the law, then a charter city has the authority to create its own law. So that's where we would have the ability and the authority to vary from what the general law, what the state code essentially says.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Any other questions for staff at this moment? All right, we have a couple speaker cards, and then we can continue with our conversation. First card I have is from Lori Collins.
Good afternoon. I want to make clear that I am not representing the coordinating council. I'm here as an individual.
Very good.
Good afternoon. The staff report before you discusses three options that just address procedure. What is not addressed is the propriety of use variances. My request is that this body recommends that the code be amended to preclude issuance of new use variances, but allow for the renewal of use variances previously granted. In 1966, the California Court of Appeals, in a case involving the charter city of San Francisco, reversed the grant of a use variance to permit an R2 use in an R1 zone, in part because, and this is to quote the case, it would be tantamount to an amendment of the zoning regulation in the guise of granting a variance. In 1970, the state legislature banned all use variances in general law cities. And as your staff has said, Burbank, Santa Monica, Pasadena, and Long Beach, which are charter cities, also do not allow use variances. The rationale for the ban of a use variance is that it's of such a consequential change that it should only be accomplished by an amendment. Such an amendment, however, could in some cases be spot zoning. Granting a use variance may be the lesser of two evils, but again is certainly not justified. When the city grants a use variance allowing for a commercial use in a residential area, for example, the change follows the procedure of a variance, but the effect is a zone change on the neighborhood. The city has made the argument that the recent history of applications for use variances indicates there's no problem that needs to be addressed. No problem could also mean there was simply no opposition, or a neighborhood ill-equipped to file opposition, or lack of effective notice. The purpose of a variance is to assure that no property, because of the special circumstances applicable to it, shall be deprived of privileges commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same zone and vicinity. Attached to the staff report is a copy of a decision granting a use variance for a three-story, this is a new three-story community center in a residential zone. The decision does not indicate that the property involved was being deprived of privileges commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same zone. The opposite is indicated in that report, that the facility would be unique to the area. I read through the findings, and the city was required, in order to grant the variance, it needed to find that the strict application of the provisions of the zoning law would result in practical difficulties or unnecessary hardship inconsistent with the general purposes and intent of the ordinance. The city found that the proposed new community use center would be unduly restricted from achieving its goal of meeting the needs of such use and the structure if the code limitations were strictly enforced. That's a self-evident proposition, obviously. Again, if I wanted to operate a bed and breakfast out of my home, that goal would also be unduly restricted by enforcing R1 restrictions encumbering my home. And the other three findings, I think, are also worthy of this board, the commission reviewing. My purpose is not to discredit the worthiness of the community center or the benefits it probably brings to the community, but the decision exemplifies the art of crafting supporting findings for a favored project versus a disfavored project. On the other hand, overturning the city's decision to grant a use variance is not an art form for the opponents, but is a battle. So I hope that you will consider making a recommendation to ban new use variances. Thank you.
Any questions for the speaker? I just have an observation in
Sure.
that I think you found an excellent example of the city using rationales to put in what everyone considers to be probably a good project for the neighborhood.
Yes.
And clearly, the things they've come up with here, in many ways, I personally find laughable. That I find your statements to be kind of persuasive. I mean, they basically have twisted things around to make a project that serves the community good fit into the use variance.
Yes, they do.
I mean, strictly speaking, it's laughable to think that it meets these criteria, but everybody decided it was a good project, so everybody sort of winked and nodded and it moved forward. However, that said, these kind of things are always going to find a way. And if I get you correctly, just kind of cutting to the chase, what you're saying in many ways, well, actually, I think what you're saying is probably just eliminate it whatsoever, at which point then it becomes a supermajority type of issue. In other words, what you're saying, okay, a project is always going to find its way through. Let's be specific and say it's this community center. If the use variance wasn't available to it, it would have come forward as an amendment to zoning, it would have been spot zoning, it might have been an overlay, they would have come up with some creative way to put it in place. However, instead of a simple majority, a 3-2 vote, it would have required a 4 out of 5 vote, meaning a supermajority. So the project still might have gone forward, but it would have required an extra level of, let's say, community support. It would have required 4 out of 5 instead of 3 out of 5 people. Now, you're saying, that path will still be available to it. You understand that, of course.
I do understand that.
Is that kind of what your rationale is here?
That is my rationale.
Okay.
I mean, the charter was written in order to provide the maximum public input and also the strictest standards to a zone change.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that should apply to someone. I have a neighbor who, because of our lots are 50 feet wide in my neighborhood, and because where a fence was placed a long time ago, his lot was only 49 feet wide, he wanted to add a very lovely second story, and he was required to get a variance. I think that my neighbor should, because he would be treated differently than other people in my neighborhood who have 2-story homes, just because of the lack of 1 foot in the width of his. And that's what a variance should be used for. But in this particular case, the one I read the report on, they clearly wanted to have this community center. But what if it was some other type of a use? I mean, as I think you're aware that I had this issue in my neighborhood where at 702 East Glen Oaks, and I guess if the right chemistry had happened, maybe they could have gotten a use variance if they'd made the right arguments. So that's my concern. I think that if you're going to be changing a use, then the public should be given it should be treated as a change in use, and the zoning law should apply, not the variance laws.
All right, thank you, Ms. Collins. Any other comments or questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. The only other card I have is Susan Roberts.
Good evening, Commission, staff. My name is Susan Roberts, and I live on Geneva Street. And I appreciate you taking the time to look at the use variance. And I'm not as schooled in all of the variations as Lori Collins is, but it was what impacted our neighborhood during the 702 Glen Oaks case. And what it seems to me that the zone change or the use variance is a backdoor way to get a zone change. And that really it's an administrative zone change, because if 702 had been allowed to have the use variance, they would have, to comply with all of the regulations, they would have had to remove the garage. Once they removed that garage, there would be no going back to a residential use for that property. And so without the community activists like Lori Collins alerting the neighborhood to what, was coming down the pike, we wouldn't have had opposition, and it very easily could have passed. And so, I don't know all of the, what could be the best procedures, but the use variance to me just seems like I said, a backdoor way to get a zone change.
All right.
That's it. Thank
Any
you.
questions or comments for that speaker? All right. Thank you, Ms. Roberts. Okay. Any other comments from staff? We'll kind of create a conversation with commissioners. Anything you want to start off with right off the bat, Wolfgang?
Well, again, I just want to remind the commission that the staff is not a supporter of significant use of the use variance process, but we do see it as a flexible tool in limited situations. So I guess that's the key. How confident are we that we're going to be able to stick to the findings and make the appropriate decision? But in all these variance cases, no matter how we structure it, there is always a level of appeal, and ultimately these decisions can be appealed to the city council. A lot of them obviously aren't. It might be, for different reasons. So ultimately, it's whether it's a zone change or a variance, and it's controversial. Ultimately, it's the city council that's going to make the decision. You do have the ability with variances to limit the degree to which you grant the approval. You don't necessarily have that in a zone change. So again, it does provide some flexibility in the appropriate situation. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I don't think the process has been abused in the past, because personally I think it has. But what's happened, and maybe there's a lesser degree of significant use variance applications, is because some of the properties where use variances were granted were rezoned at a later time to, projects were approved originally under a variance, and then once they were there, the zone was changed to accommodate that use if things were operating smoothly. Ideally, that's not the preferred way to do things. I said I don't think we've been doing it that way for quite some time on any kind of grand scale at all. So, again, if somebody's dissatisfied with a decision, whether it's zoning administrators or any one of us that's the hearing officer or the Board of Zoning Appeals or now the Planning Commission, they can always appeal it to the City Council.
Okay.
Clarify one point.
What I was just going to say is at some point we'll have our own opinions and our thoughts. What I'd like to do initially is let's just keep asking questions.
Right.
So please go ahead, Mr. Sheets.
Thank you. The point you made about there's always an appeal potential, that's if there is a use variance. If there is no use variance, there's nothing to appeal. They have to take another alternative, correct?
Right. So if you, let's say you ban use variances, then all of these situations that I mentioned in the staff report would have to be addressed in a different manner. So if I'm planning to put this community center or maybe just a pure commercial building in a residential zone, I have the option. Obviously, I'm not going to get the code amended to have a commercial use in a residential zone, so my most logical option is a zone change. If it's contiguous to commercial property, maybe I've got a shot at it. If it's out in the middle of residential, it depends on what I'm asking for. If it's a neighborhood serving use, then maybe there's a possibility. But again, they would be limited to, in most cases, a zone change, and in a few cases, a code amendment where if it was a little more subtle, maybe they could request that, and then the zoning code could actually be amended to allow that particular use in that particular zone. Not just at that location that somebody has in mind, but throughout the city. That's one of the drawbacks I see to a lot of variance applications is that people might have some of the findings, but a lot of times their situation applies to about everybody else in the same zone. So really, it'd be more appropriate to ask for a code amendment anyway. So a ban on use variances would take some of that out of the equation. But again, for that property owner that has 10, 15, 20 feet of the back of the lot in a residential zone, they want to extend their parking lot a little bit, kind of a problem. But again, you can ask for, the alternative then is you ask for a zone change. It's not that much more money. It's obviously a little more complicated. But then if the council feels that's appropriate, then the actual zone boundary would be moved.
Just on that same line then, based on what you put together for us in the package, of these 10 examples you provided, do you feel that all of them would have pursued those changes if there was no use variance?
Well, some of them are renewals, so they're
True.
kind of stuck. I mean, I just did one recently myself. I was the hearing officer for a very minor thing for approving a use variance for serving alcohol at a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
That's normally a conditional use permit, or it's just allowed. The reason that was a use variance is because the use itself, the restaurant, is in a zone that doesn't permit restaurants, but it's another commercial zone that permits pretty much only offices. Now, that the shopping center that was that restaurant in, that portion of the shopping center is in the CPD zone, commercial plan development, which is basically an office zone, and the front is either C2 or C3. To build the center, they had to get a use variance. So if you didn't allow use variances, they would have had to have gone for a zone change. And maybe there's a good chance that they would have gotten it. Would have been much cleaner. I would have certainly preferred that and wouldn't have to be dealing with the minutia at this time. So in terms of the use variance that I granted, it's pretty minor. In terms of the original one, 20 or 25 years ago, it was controversial, and it actually bounced back and forth a couple of times. Actually, it was the city council that ended up approving that use variance because there was a neighborhood objection to that part of the center going into that zone.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for staff?
When does a zone change to accommodate something like that be deemed a spot zoning, which I take as a bad thing?
Spot zoning has sort of a bad reputation. It's generally considered not good planning. On the other hand,
It's not illegal.
well,
It's not very
it's
clean.
frowned upon, yeah. I mean, it's not illegal.
It's
if
not
you-
elegant, is that what you're trying to say?
That's not elegant. But you could have a neighborhood commercial center, like C1, in the middle of a residential area, that might be very appropriate. You know, if you have a collection of a certain size of, I did that for emphasis.
Thank you.
A certain size of collection of properties. If you just zoned one single property to get in a little market, that might be kind of questionable.
So I'm not going to get the Dairy Queen across the street from Miss Collins.
Yeah, that's just
That's next week.
really not likely to happen. You're more likely that most of the requests are at the border of something in terms of commercial intrusion into residential zones. That's what most of the situations are. That's what the 702 East Glen Oaks, even the one that's in your packet that is the community center, that was on the edge of the commercial district. It's the lot next to it.
Mr. Hagani?
If I may just add some perspective, I do not really have a position one way or another. I worked in a city, the general law city, that did not allow use variances at all for many years. And I must say that the use variances are an imperfect tool for imperfect zoning situations. And to remove them, you will have to deal with other imperfect tools. And then the zone change process is another such a tool. And in the city where I worked, in the zone change approach that sometimes people had to go through in order to get what they wanted could take different forms. In one case, for example, they asked to add a few uses to the list of permitted uses in a particular zone where otherwise, for example, if they were in Glendale, they probably would have just asked for a use variance in that case. So a legislative process was followed in order to allow that particular use in that particular zone. And similar to what you might see in a use variance here, the community did not necessarily, in this case, I can tell you it was about animal hospitals in a residential zone, in a particular type of residential zone. In that town, nobody seemed to mind that, and then they allowed that to be added to the list of permitted uses. Is that a perfect solution? Is that a better solution? I don't know, but I can tell you that people resort to other ways to approach you and the city council to ask for what they want. And then also, I must add that in most other general law cities, a zone change does not necessarily require a supermajority. In those cases, usually a simple majority is involved as well. Just wanted to add that.
As opposed to
perspective.
Glendale,
Yes,
where it's a
correct.
supermajority.
The other side of that, using your example about the animal hospitals,
Right.
is if it's suddenly, if there's an amendment to the zoning for that area, and suddenly animal hospitals are allowed, then there's no conditional use. There's no way that any of the zoning people, the planning commission, or the city council could impose, additional restrictions on it, covering, let's say, the noise that an animal hospital might create and so on.
Conditions.
So, when you slap it in as an approved use, you're opening the door for some unintended consequences.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say.
So adding that is tough. Okay. Other questions? Because I have several.
When I realized that there was going to be a question, you gave the examples of the cities that do and do not have use variances, and two of them neighbor us. Do we have a feel for how often they have issues, and if in fact they don't have them, do they run into spot zoning issues, stuff like that?
Yeah, that I'm not aware of. I mean, these are all established communities, and I don't know the history. Perhaps they haven't been using maybe the prohibited use variances for some time, and everybody's adjusted to that. I think the longer you go, the more cases you approve, the harder it is to reverse that.
Right.
So through the grapevine, I haven't heard of anything.
Building on Mr. Sheets' question, do these other cities used to have them and then they pulled them out, or we don't know?
That I don't know.
Okay, so we don't know if it was ever within their structure.
No. In fact, well, let's see. Well, I shouldn't talk about any of the other cities in detail, but I think one of them even has a longer list of things they don't allow variances for.
I'm
Glendale-
guessing to the east rather than the west.
The Glendale used to, for example, prohibit variance applications for prohibited types of signs for a while. Couldn't apply for a variance for a roof sign. Couldn't apply for a variance for a projecting sign. Couldn't apply for a variance for a non-accessory sign or a billboard. But that sounds great. It's sort of the same thinking as, well, you can't apply for a use variance, but when you think about it, there's all kinds of different subtle situations, especially when it comes to something like signs. There's very little difference in some cases, the angle of the roof between a roof sign and a wall sign. And so we thought about that and thought, well, maybe we don't need to be that strict. Again, the findings should be there to protect us, but there are so many subtle distinctions that maybe we should just eliminate that, and that was taken out of the code a long, long time ago, but there was a short period of time where you couldn't apply for a variance for something like that. So it's not that we haven't done something like that before, but we've reversed ourselves.
The draft ordinance in front of us, unless I'm missing it, which is entirely possible, doesn't seem to address the concept of, let's say, grandfathered or pre-existing conditions.
No, this is just council's option 3. Very simple. Same
Okay, it's
process.
very simple, but what's it do? Here's what's going to happen. If we vote, I'm theorizing here, if we vote and push this on to city council, every single project that would become non-conforming and is going to be in front of city council going, what are you doing to us?
No, that one won't. That's basically status quo. It just removes the zoning administrator out of the process.
Okay, that's the only change in
That's
this
the
one.
only change in that
Yeah, the one
one. I
that's-
said,
All
if you're interested in the one where you allow renewals, then let's talk about the details.
Okay,
If
so it's not
then
changing yet?
No,
It's
the-
not, okay.
the draft
By the fact that
ordinance-
it's not in it, that's what I was
Right,
confused.
the version 3 is essentially only taking the zoning administrator out as the initial hearing body or
Right.
person.
And making the commission it.
You would be the initial decision maker. Still, regular majority, not supermajority.
I guess I want to revisit a little bit that it seems like the only concern that I'm hearing, that in general, what we're talking about here is a raising of the bar, going from the simple to the super, and potentially getting rid of the zoning administrator as part of the process. But the concept was, but then we won't have findings, and that's a problem.
That's only, the supermajority is the problem with when you have a certain vote. It's only when you have a certain vote in favor, but not supermajority.
Right, but can't we, and I'll look at legal, can't there be a way to weave that into the rules?
Yes, and we talked about, there's a way to write it. The problem is then you don't have any addressing of the findings to back up the decision.
Why not? Don't understand that.
Because, let's say, 3 planning commissioners or 3 council members are voting for it. Well, that must be the way they feel. Okay, well, if there's no other motion, that ends it. But you have a failed, it's de facto, by the way the law would have to be structured, considered a denial. But nobody's made any findings, because the motion was in favor of approval with positive findings, not negative findings. But it didn't carry because you only had 3 votes and not 4.
Oh, I see.
So you can write it into the law, it's that, but when you really think about it, you've got this quasi-judicial decision. 3 members of the planning commission or the council think findings are there, and yet it's not approved. But there's no discussion of why those findings aren't present, even to say that the applicant didn't provide evidence to support the findings, or it's a self-imposed hardship, or it's really not unique, or, you know how we usually do that, and we make some attempt to address why all of the findings can't be made. And that's not going to happen if you have a majority of the members of the body thinking that the findings are present. You just can't make people reverse things. So it's very clumsy. It's not that it can't be written. It doesn't work very well in quasi-judicial application. So, again, between the city attorney and the planning staff, we're kind of backing off. Seemed like the thing to do at the time to kind of make it consistent with a zone change, but didn't work too well.
And of course, the zone change doesn't require findings, it just
That's
requires
right.
4 city councilmen to think.
You
it's a
change
good
the,
idea.
change the general plan if necessary. You just have to have 4 council people think it's a good idea. You don't
And for a
have,
municipal code change, is that still supermajority?
if it's a zoning regulation, yes. Yes, same thing. Right.
One of the reasons that we even suggested the idea of perhaps if the concern of the neighborhood members is that maybe a use variance is being heard by the zoning administrator, for some reason people have not heard about it or do not understand the weight of the issue that it might present in their neighborhood, therefore nobody shows up at the ZA hearing, and then a variance is given, and then all of a sudden we have to deal with the aftermath. And that is a really legitimate concern. So that was the reason that we said, okay, maybe then we could go directly to the Planning Commission for a use variance, because even if nobody in the neighborhood shows up, we think that the Planning Commission, because you make the recommendation on policy, on land use policy to the city council. And when you look at variances, you look at it in the context of the purpose of that particular zone and the intent of that particular zone and whether or not that use is consistent with the intent of that zone. With 5 members, you have a better chance of protecting the neighborhood against those types of unforeseen consequences.
Okay, I hear that argument, but two things come to mind. First is the very current situation that happened with the park fees and the use of the fees, where it basically went from nowhere to suddenly in front of the commission to suddenly in front of the council, and then all of a sudden the community realized what was happening. Because there was, let's say, a lack of hearings, a lack of outreach, that's a much better way of stating it, suddenly council gets to revisit it, and it's inefficient and everybody's upset, and it's just not good government. The idea here, I guess the intent here of putting it in front of us and getting the ZA out of the way to raise the awareness is laudable, but I think this would actually have the opposite effect. By removing the ZA, you're removing, outreach, you're removing notification, for the initial period. You're also removing an entire opportunity for planning staff, the trained professionals, to vest what the request is, to work through it, to develop it, to negotiate it, to make initial findings, to really work over what the whole thing is, instead of throwing something into our lap at one hearing. So I think by in effect, you're streamlining the process, and by streamlining, I think you're actually serving the opposite of creating outreach. Please.
I think you may be misunderstanding a little bit the process. There is actually a difference. When something comes before the Planning Commission, in fact, staff prepares a staff report and makes an analysis and proposes findings, proposes a recommendation based on whether or not the findings cannot be made. That is slightly different than how we present staff reports to the zoning administrator. At this point, staff only give a presentation of the proposal, and the zoning administrator actually, or the officer, makes the analysis and the findings. That is different. Still, the public hearing before the Planning Commission will be noticed. The 500-foot radius noticing will be done, the newspaper noticing will be done, and you will also have the added benefit of a staff report with an analysis that will be published prior to your hearing. So staff actually gets involved, perhaps the case planners get involved even a little bit more in those cases, because the entire responsibility is not given to the zoning administrator.
But in the first case, the zoning administrator, all that publication still occurs.
Correct.
It just occurs, frankly, earlier in the process, and you're taking out an entire opportunity for the community to weigh in. Now they only have 2 chances instead of 3. I mean, and that concerns me, because I understand, just looking at the parks as an example, the issue with the fields is how slow the public is to necessarily realize there's a problem and interrupt their busy lives to form committees and, mobs, if you will, and address what was an unintended problem, or unintended consequence, rather.
That's absolutely correct.
What stage are we at?
We're in question, conversation. I kind of was debating a little bit with Mr. Hagani, but...
Well, that is accurate what you said, Mr. Chair, and that is the trade-off that would, yes, one step would be removed. And we were, in looking for ways of addressing the concern that we were hearing, we were trying to address one particular issue, which is that if there's one hearing officer actually hearing the entire case, and the community might feel, it takes something from the community, on the community's part, to actually organize themselves and come and have their voice heard. That would not go away even if the case came directly to the Planning Commission. The only thing that would change, yes, one step would be removed from, and one opportunity would be removed for community input. However, that first opportunity, 5 members of the Planning Commission as opposed to one person would be analyzing this. That is the only trade-off.
And the other difference is that the first time the public sees it, in the case of the current situation, there's no staff report, there's no information, there's just some PVAR number and no background for the public to see online or with a notice. In the proposed amendment, the public would also have the benefit of the staff report and a lot more detail and maybe be more motivated to or find reasons to come address the planning commission, whereas they might not have found reasons to address the zoning administrator.
Mr. Menuchyan?
Since we're deliberating,
We are.
quasi-deliberating,
Everything we do is pretty quasi.
pretty
Quasi-judicial.
Exactly.
one of the things, the word that we seem to come back to over and over again is public, and the public's participation in the process as a whole. I think that is the most important thing. I think Commissioner Torgerson just pointed out the benefit of the proposed ordinance in the sense that, yes, although it streamlines the process by reducing one layer, it makes it more efficient by providing the public with a upfront perspective as to what is being asked from the commission. And the other aspect that I would like to point out is that in my years, I've noticed that this body, this commission, is much more flexible to the requests of to the statements made by the public than perhaps the zoning administrator would be. As members of the community, as people who have, as part of our community life, we're more familiar with what's going on. There's a sense of flexibility and sensitivity that I discern here that may not necessarily be present when you have one government bureaucrat reviewing the matter. That's as far as that is concerned. An example is being raised of the parks fees. I have a particular ox that was gored by that because I'm an AYSO coach. The AYSO does a fantastic job in this region, but maybe it's time for the AYSO to have a government liaison officer. I mean, God knows they have officers for everything else.
Leonard.
And with all apologies to the commissioner of the region, maybe it's time that the AYSO become more involved in the process. If you're not, if you're not interested in politics, politics will eventually become interested in you. Which is by way of saying the community needs to be more involved. I'm loath to make excuses for people who have 3-story community centers built in their neighborhood if they are unhappy with it when they haven't stepped up and said, no, we don't like this. If enough people had showed up during that hearing, I suspect the third finding, which is, the granting of the variance will not be materially detrimental to the public welfare or injurious to the property or improvements in such zone or neighborhood. Well, if enough people get up there and say, I don't want this next to my house or in my neighborhood, that is de facto, by definition, that is injurious. So, let the people come forward. I'm not willing to make excuses for them. Also, I'm sort of biased in the sense that in the last few years that I've been on this commission, and in the last few months that we've done the appeals, we saw through some of the chicanery that was presented before us. We saw the 702 Glen Oaks. We saw through that.
But so did the zoning administrator.
Well,
it was denied by them. It was appealed to us.
It was appealed to us, and we called it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And don't forget, the underlying theme here is, to a certain extent, as Mr. Harhani pointed out, is to streamline the process. So, if it had not been the case, I would have said, yes, this is one of those circumstances where streamlining actually kind of creates a larger blind spot. But seeing that, no, in fact, that blind spot isn't there, I'm okay with the streamlining. I suppose that's what I'm saying. And last thing, I promise. Supermajorities, I hate them. They go against the grain. You bring something soft and fuzzy in front of 5 politicians, you're going to get a supermajority. We've seen that happen this year. So, just as a simple majority, we're simple people, simple majorities are good enough for us. You know, I don't want to create this steep hill that all applicants need to climb to get what we want. We're a community, there's needs for some flexibility. This whole variance thing, I like it because it gives people some space, some breathing room. We're not all perfect. That's me.
Thank you, Mr. Menuchyan. Mr. Torgerson?
It seemed to me that I'm 100% in favor of moving out of the one person deciding the case for all the reasons previously cited. I agree with Mr. Menuchyan on supermajorities. And I also agree with Mr. Menuchyan on the two things that scare me about doing away with the use variances altogether and requiring a zone change or a municipal code change is that for the warm and fuzzy, it's easy to get a supermajority reason. That's one reason I'm a little leery of that. The other reason is that with the Planning Commission, with the amendment as suggested here, the Planning Commission has the ability to add conditions. So you could have the animal shelter instead of the Dairy Queen, and you could have the conditions that it'd be quiet and it's closed before 10 o'clock and so forth. Whereas if you eliminated the variance and you had a supermajority city council because the right people showed up at the right time and had the zone changed so that animal shelters were allowed in all residential areas, then all pandemonium would likely break loose. You wouldn't be able to put conditions on it or limit it to a small, unique, special circumstance. So Mr. Menuchyan and I are in agreement on the proposed amendment.
Mr. Sheets?
Probably would be a majority of 1 if I continued to pursue the fact that we eliminate use variances. That's the sense I'm getting here, unless somebody feels different. So my feeling is this started out to be a process to eliminate use variances. I haven't seen enough evidence that make me think that we need them, but I don't know that I need to get into that right now if that's where other people are. But I'll give you a couple comments why I feel that way, at least with my limited understanding of the variances from what we were given. The one point is it was not only has it been discussed at the council, it was brought up by the homeowners in a forum, in multiple forums, and I think they gave good reasons why use variances might not be necessary. Other cities, there are other cities that are close to us and similar in many ways that don't have use variances, and I don't hear, not that I would, but I don't hear a lot of screaming and yelling that they're having problems with spot zoning and so on, but we didn't have any of that data, so it's kind of a question to me. What I'm hearing about use variances when they were used in the 60s and 70s, it was for what seemed to be pretty good reasons. You have a school there or a hospital and they needed something new, technology changed or there was growth in the city and they expanded out a parking lot or they applied something that wasn't available or wasn't used when they built that project. So I'm not so sure that what we're dealing with is anything like that in these use variances that have been described to me. My sense in just reading this and not a very in-depth research beyond that is that the findings can be very subjective, depending on what you want to do and how much support you have around that. That's my perception. it seems to me the examples we got were minor issues, at least on the surface in reading them. I'm sure they weren't minor to whoever presented them. But I don't know that these people would have gone beyond the desire to have this change if there was a lack of the use variance. And the other point, as far as having to go another route, maybe that would be a good thing. Maybe that would be more appropriate. I sense as we go through time, there, at least in our city, there seems to be a trend to want to change things. Whereas, and I understand that happens. We're growing, we've been around a long time. People want to make changes and adjustments. But I don't know that that's always good. And this, having a use variance allows us an additional opportunity to try to do that. I'm not so sure that all of these would have gone forward if there wasn't a use variance. And having said that, I'll make 2 points and then I'm done. Outreach is a difficult problem for any city. I personally feel I have significant experience regarding outreach with my background in the city for the past 30, 40 years in projects I've been involved in, and kind of on both sides, as a resident and also working on previous commissions for the sports complex and other, for the Edison project and other large projects. It's an imperfect process, and I truly believe and will never be convinced that you can do it perfect, and you'll never convince the residents that they got enough notice. But having said that, I think and I feel strongly that it's something extremely important, especially in our city, with our diversity and our changes and our growth. I think we need to look at that. I think the whole city needs to look at that in a better way. So, depending on which way this goes, an item that I have in mind would be, now this is kind of a question and a thought, is it possible to incorporate if there is a use variance, incorporate a step where we actually have a public hearing to have people talk about this, and instead of having them come here at night, they might not come by, few people talk, and then we make a decision. Is there a possibility of having a hearing? Not that I want to have more meetings, but if we want to do this right and not have the appeals, I believe we want to hear. I believe it's important that they get to speak, and we have a chance to kind of let that digest and sift through our thought process. And having said all of that, that's kind of where I am right now.
All right. Well, actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, we're the public hearing. So
we are, but
you're speaking in the outreach aspect.
Another layer for outreach.
Well, thank you for having a slightly different perspective, because it allows me to plop right down in the middle of everyone's opinion, which is the best part about being chairperson. I have my concerns on the outreach. And again, what we're basically going to do is recommend to council. We'll have a vote, we'll recommend, and we're going to basically be able to say what we thought, the things we're saying here. And it all follows the outreach. It all follows the public awareness. And I'm willing to bet that the coordinating council hasn't seen this draft ordinance to be able to weigh in. Their initial thought about getting rid of the use variances has basically been softened, and this is what's come out of council initially, right?
So, Mike, they haven't seen which one?
They haven't seen this proposed ordinance.
Oh, okay.
What the coordinating council, and again, only because they're a recognized group of a number of interested homeowners, organizations, and activists, and so on. They're kind of a good group to at least get a sense of what one portion of the community feels. They want to get rid of use variances. Now, what we have in front of us is this mild little half step that, again, I think has unintended consequences. And I made my statement earlier, so I'm not going to be redundant, but building along the lines of outreach, I'm greatly concerned about removing the zoner administrator process, only because I think the streamlining hurts the public good. That's where I am on that. I understand streamlining, I like efficiency, I like all that. On the concept of simple majority versus supermajority, I am willing to be persuaded more on the concept of elimination of use variances. I'm not there yet. I've seen the process. I've been involved with the Board of Zoning Board of Zoning Appeals for 6 years. I've been on Planning Commission a little more than 3. So I've seen a lot of the process. And the process pretty much works with majority versus supermajority. Now, that said, I understand the coordinating council, homeowners in general, wanting to raise the bar because it stops things from changing. And that can be for the good, but it can also be for the bad. But what I've seen with the majority process is it still works pretty well. You look at the things that got denied, you look at the things that got approved, you look at the negotiation and the development based on the role of the zoning administrator and then us, and in some cases council, it's a good process. That said, I'm still willing to look at the concept of eliminating use variances. And I would challenge Mr. Garcia and by extension the legal department to work through this whole concept of the findings and how bad it would be if we have 3 people voting versus 4, and push forward the idea of let's get rid of the zoning variance of the use variances, and then just work through what the consequences are. Work through 5 scenarios, 10 scenarios, whatever. I mean, nobody wants to see rendering plants suddenly become a permitted use in R1R. And then have no chance to put conditions on it. That's what we want to guard against. But it seems like there's ways of still raising the bar, but doing it in a way where property owners have rights and the neighbors have rights. So that was long-winded and so on. But just telegraphing, I can't vote to support the ordinance, the draft ordinance as written. So I'm guessing that we're probably going to have some sort of 2-2 vote on the part of the Planning Commission. City Council will hear either through tape or through the planning staff passing on our thoughts, and then they can act accordingly. So to the purposes of hearing from the citizenry, from hearing from interested planning commissioners with their perspectives, I think we've accomplished what we need to as it relates to moving on to City Council. So that said, could we have a motion? Or are there other comments? I'm sorry.
One question. In your perception, how would the currently existing variances be dealt with?
Well, that's one of the keys. I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's important, and I believe Ms. Collins in her letter actually alluded to it as well, is there is no way on this earth that we're going to get rid of use variances unless there's a mechanism in place for the existing variances to be able to be carried forward. Call it grandfathering if you will, but grandfathering with the right of being able to continue as a renewable use variance in 10 years, 15 years, whenever it comes up. That, I think, would be a key component of getting rid of use variances. So I'm glad you brought that up. Because if we ignore it, it's dead on arrival. We're wasting our breath even talking about it.
So, Mr. Chair, can I clarify? It seems that you are generally in favor of eliminating use variances?
I am not there yet, but I am eager to look at it. I have an open mind on it. I think there's a way, knowing that our peer communities and, that we're almost, I hesitate to, Torrance is a fine community, I'm sure. I've probably been there once. But I hesitate to compare ourselves to Torrance. Our peer communities, the communities that we look up to, or in some cases look down to, don't have this in their makeup. So I think there's probably a good way for us to get rid of it, but I want to understand what the consequences are.
Well, then, before we go back to Mr. Sheets, you are in favor of eliminating use variances, but would you support the ability to renew the ones that...
Oh, yes. I didn't make that statement, but I think that's necessary.
Okay.
Straw poll.
No, I should clarify, too, that my first instinct is to eliminate use variances and grandfather the existing ones. However, that being said... That's
supermajority.
The thing that tipped the scales for me was the thought that, okay, what are the probabilities of a bad outcome, either a 3-to-5 vote of a commission that can put special conditions on a single project, or a 4-to-1 vote of the city council for a zoning change or code change that affects the entire zone. And when I think of it like that, I think, well, okay, maybe the 3 to 5 with ability to put conditions on an individual project is a better idea than just eliminating use variances altogether and making people go to the city council, because the city council doesn't have time for all the details that we get into a lot of times. And when a zone change or a track, somebody, it seems really simple to just draw a little line and make this one house that's next to the commercial district part of the commercial zone. All you got to do is just draw a little line. That's easy. And the city council isn't going to have the time to get into the kind of details and background and why did we zone it that way in the first place. And that's my fear. And so in a case like that, I think the city council, you'd have more of a probability of having the city council make that decision 4-1, as opposed to maybe a better outcome when you've got 3-2 on the planning commission and we have time to think about it and maybe put some conditions if necessary. And so that's where I'm coming from.
And actually, you very succinctly put why I'm vacillating. I like philosophically the idea of getting rid of them, but I love the concept of us being able to deliberate and drop conditions on and really look at the specifics of something without, unintended consequences.
Well, speaking of unintended consequences, the idea of getting rid of the zoning variances as a whole, all three of you are saying, get rid of them all, but maintain and grandfather those that are on the books. Now, if this concept is so bad that you want to get rid of it, why are you grandfathering it? If it is such a good thing that through this process we have now in our community such jewels like schools and community centers and so on, by virtue of this process, why do you want to get rid of it? I understand that I just did a little bit of circular logic, but think about it. You are saying, what you're saying is in opposite to itself. That's why I prefer to make conditions. I don't like the process of variances that much, although I appreciate its fruits. But I prefer the idea of being able to set conditions while giving a community member what he or she wants, as opposed to foreclosing that possibility.
Well, you used a broad brush to characterize the three of us as being in favor of getting rid of use variances. That was not stated.
Okay, as a general process,
I appreciate the style that you delivered it in.
Thank you.
And again, we're all saying the same thing. We like the idea. It's all about what works for the community. Whether it's conditions or abolishing them or whatever, let's keep working through that. Let's not just say no to, let's not just say get rid of them, but also let's not ignore the concept of getting rid of them. Other communities have done very well without them. And the reason we're talking about the existing facilities being able to carry forward, at some point you have to draw a line in the sand. And rather than bulldozing down an entire, 30-block area of a city, you take little steps. And if the process carries forward and we get rid of use variances, it's totally appropriate to let the people that operated under a different, under a different sun, if you will, the chance to continue living in that environment. We have that all over the city with non-conforming uses. So to me, the conversation needs to continue. Whether use variances disappear from the face of the earth or we continue them, I still want to challenge staff to pursue that. I'm not comfortable with the idea, we shouldn't get rid of it because of the fining question. I mean, there's got to be ways to work around that. Now, you were kind of surveying us on some things. Did you complete your little straw poll?
I think I understand. Two of the commissioners, actually, although we have some reservations about use variances, essentially support the draft ordinance. That was pretty clear. And Commissioner Sheets is leaning in the direction of a ban with some sort of ability to provide for reapplications / renewals of those projects that already have them if they have a time limit. Okay? So, and Mr. Chair, you philosophically don't like them, but you prefer the ability to be able to impose conditions. You think it's not really broken at this point, and you would definitely like to see the zoning administrator continue as the original hearing officer. Seems
for
pretty clear.
outreach. It's all about the outreach. It's all about the community understanding it.
So
Yeah. Right.
So
I
we
guess
don't
that's
really have
close enough.
a majority. Yeah, it's a recommendation, but it's a lot cleaner if we do have a majority recommendation. So
Yeah, does anybody want to?
The only clarification on what the chairman said, I thought he mentioned that we would go back and get some more input about what the potential might be, how it might work out if we got rid of the zoning variances, what the impacts would be.
I want to see this agendized
Yeah, okay.
at some point in the next 6 or 8 weeks, something like that, where you guys have spent a little more time with it in the course of all the other deadlines that you're dealing with, and really work through some consequences and some ideas. And if there's still, and just give us more of your development. Okay, I know you've had some sessions with Mr. Garcia and so on, but let's keep looking at it, I think is what I'm hearing.
Continue this then?
No, I don't want to continue it.
Well, then it's still-
No. This is a draft ordinance, okay? Let's make our notes, our conversation known. Let's send it on to council. If council wants to vote on this or not vote on this, they're going to give you some more input too. The whole idea about us voting on it is so council can have some more conversation. And, they're not going to be happy with this. When was this going to go in front of council?
August 12th, I believe.
Okay, that gives, well, no, it doesn't. I know for a fact, coordinating council won't be meeting before this. It'll all be, people chatting. And again, I keep using coordinating council. I just want to stress, I only use them as a recognized group of homeowners that, care about aspects of the community. I'm not saying that we have to listen to them. I'm not saying we have to live our lives around whatever they say. But, let's give the community a chance to talk about this a little more.
Right, they do cover a broad spectrum of the city with the homeowners association.
Yeah, exactly. So for this to go in front of council in the first week of August, it sounds premature to me.
Well,
But that's
the
up to
advertised
them.
date.
Well,
So the purpose is to...
you know what? Then maybe we shouldn't vote on it, just to, but I'm not going to play that power trip. My feeling is let's vote on it, let's move it off our desk, let's put it at council. Council can hear what we've said, act as they so choose. I think that the concept of use variances needs further review, and that this measure may be good, it may be bad, but let's continue on with the broader conversation in the future. Is that fair, Mr. Hagani?
It is fair, and let me just add, if I may, one of the considerations that I have about, actually my main consideration about the removal of use variances as a tool is that in my 5 years plus of experience in the city of Glendale, I've noticed that our zoning designations in many locations do not necessarily reflect the realities that you see on the ground. And being a city that's over 100 years old and have the variety of land uses in such a vast area of 32 square miles, actually is bound to be pregnant with situations where what you have on paper does not match what you have on the streets. So this would leave us some way to deal with certain imperfect situations where we think we have something there and we have something completely different. That's the only reason. And to address the level of analysis that you're talking about, Mr. Chair, I think really it does require a comprehensive analysis of a lot of our zoning designations across the city to really do a thorough analysis of, okay, these are the lots that would be impacted by potentially if we remove this tool from the picture. Because we do have several lots, for example, that Mr. Kraus pointed out that we have split zoning on the same lot, and some of those lots, one part of the zone is actually landlocked. And the community may not really necessarily like the idea of changing the zoning designation on that piece of the lot, and those situations become point of discussion. We could move the recommendation to continue this item, if that is what you'd like to do, to the City Council as well.
Well, I mean, here's what I wish could happen maybe, is to just kind of succinctly put it to the council and say, council members, how do you feel? You have a use variance process where it takes 3 out of 5, and it's a deliberative body. Here's how it's been working, here's how it hasn't been working. How do you feel about that versus raising the bar, changing the bar, if you will, getting rid of it, and going to the supermajority? Are you happy with a 3 out of 5? Then let's just keep it the way it is. If you think you want to go 4 out of 5, well, A, let's talk about why, and B, are 4 of you guys actually going to vote for it? Because we need 4 out of 5 for them to vote for it as well. So if we can't get 4 out of 5 to even vote for the 4 out of 5 option, we can find a lot better things to do with staff time, I'm suspecting. All right. So what's your thoughts, gentlemen, about continuation versus voting?
I personally feel it should be continued. I have concerns if I'm interpreting your take, Mr. Kane. Although I see the value in it, I have concerns about going back to the council to interact with them or to have some sort of feedback that so can come back here. I just don't feel they'll be comfortable doing that. So my take would be do what we want to get out of that by sending it off to have the staff do that, get the information, do the research, and bring it back to us.
And work over amending, or putting forward potential amendments in our deliberations.
Exactly. So we add some meat to the bone and kind of put it together in a way that we put in our thoughts and our ideas and then let them deal with it.
Mr. Mnuchin, your thoughts?
Fine.
What do you feel about it, Mr. Torgerson?
Well, I know on March 4th, City Council requested this based on a resolution from the Homeowners Coordinating Council. And there's no evidence that the Coordinating Council has seen this or had a chance to weigh in on it.
Good
So I
point.
think a continuation, if nothing else, to at least get Margaret Hammond in and hear what the Coordinating Council has to say about it before we could vote on anything and take it to the City Council would be warranted.
Why don't we request that? Instead of them, if it's hard and fast in the next agenda.
Oh, if we don't act, they'll just change the agenda.
Okay, very good.
And the council members might get to go home 5 minutes
I
earlier.
agree with that point that they
They probably won't mind in August leaving a few minutes early. Sorry, I lost a train of thought. Oh, the other aspect about it is in terms of advertising and stuff, this was advertised, obviously. So if we continue, it should be to a date certain, correct?
Correct, unless you'd like to just continue it to a date uncertain, and then at the time that we
Then renotice?
renotice, yes.
So get this again on the 30th.
I'm thinking of, gentlemen, we can either continue at date uncertain, which I kind of favor, or if we pin down a date, I'd be looking at something October. I feel maybe we should make a date uncertain just to let staff work through their stuff, continue the outreach. I don't consider this an urgent, that's what I was coming up with, I lost my train of thought. This is not an urgency ordinance. I mean, there's nothing on here, there's nothing that, if we continue a status quo, is hurting a thing. The process just continues the way the process has. So I'm fine with continuing it, and then we'll re-advertise when staff gets some information together and so on. Does that make sense?
I agree.
Mr. Chair, I do want to clarify that the draft ordinance was the option 3 that council told us to include. So it's a very clean version. There's no complications there. So the Homeowners Coordinating Council is aware of that option. We discussed it, Mr. Ghani and myself, with the representatives of the Homeowners Coordinating Council, and they do support that, but again, with the supermajority that was indicated in your staff report.
That's not in front of us with option 3.
No, because council,
Right. All we've got
council's option 3 was...
all we have in
what you're
front of
looking at.
this is removing the zoning administrator from the current process.
Right.
Right? That's all
You
option 3
could
is.
recommend another option, just because you don't have the draft ordinance, doesn't mean you can't recommend another option. That was just one of the 3 options that the council wanted us to bring to you.
Right, and with some feedback, we might have another option after the research is done.
Go ahead, Mr. Hargani.
And for additional clarification, it would be very helpful to staff to know what kind of research you would like staff to do. Because if the purpose is to have additional discussion with community members and the coordinating council members, we do know their position very clearly. We don't disagree with their position. However, we have raised technical difficulties with taking that position. And if it is the desire of the Planning Commission to recommend banning use variances, staff would be happy to forward that recommendation. I believe, it's my understanding that additional conversation with the coordinating council will only affirm that their preferred position is to ban use variances, and then, or maybe to go to the supermajority. If it is also your recommendation to go to the supermajority and direct legal to address the legal difficulties that we have explained today, we could also do that. And I might add that another large part of the constituency that are the primary applicants for use variances is not as well organized as and communicative as the coordinating council, and those tend to be commercial users. If you notice, most of the use variances are applied for by commercial users, and if you wanted to reach out to those applicants and that constituency, that would take some time and some coordinated approach to, and a lot of in-depth discussion and additional outreach.
Well, but the reason is they're all project specific. Okay, unless you're, let's say, an individual that represents a string of them, either in the real estate or in the planning type of industry, they're all project specific. Whereas the coordinating council is, project non-specific. So the outreach is totally different and so on. I guess, and I watch a lot of council on TV, but I don't watch their entire meetings. And I don't know what city council really feels. It hasn't been put in front of me. I didn't watch that part of the meeting. I don't know what city council really feels about eliminating the use variance. I did not see that. I know how coordinating council feels, but, and if there was clear direction from city council, I'm hearing you guys tell us that this is it. I just have doubts that this is it. This is such a weak non-step. I just don't get it.
This is one of the options. And I think, as Mr. Krause said, you have the option of selecting another option, even if it's one of the not any of the options that the council directed us to follow. You're welcome to give that preferred option as your recommendation.
Yeah, including the status quo, which is to not change anything. That's a recommendation as well.
Well, in effect, if we don't remove the ZA, that's status quo.
Right.
Right? Okay. I guess maybe it's just a curmudgeon and an old fuddy-duddy, but I'm more of a status quo guy right now, unless I can see some more evidence for the need to eliminate the use variances. Or finding a way that legal doesn't get upset with supermajority concepts.
Well, that in itself is sort of a majority right now, because three of the commissioners then right now, today, favor keeping the use variance. You just have two that favor going straight to Planning Commission and one that favors keeping the ZA.
If you asked where I am today, that's a fair statement. Whether that's where we all are a month or 2 months from now with further information, we shall see. Okay.
Continue this until Mr. Jarrow gets back.
I say we continue it. All right. Would someone like to make a motion to continue to a date uncertain?
That would essentially be tabling it.
Yeah. Okay.
And just give us an idea of approximately, again, when you'd like us to come back, and as Son indicated, is there specific information that you would like us to come back with? Because, again, there are infinite number of possibilities of use variance applications.
Okay.
How many are in the... We've had 8 in the last 4 years, was that it? Or is it the last 2 years?
Well, beginning of
2006?
06, we've had, what did I say, 8 approved and 2 denied?
So 4 a year.
Yeah.
That's kind of the trend. 4 or 5 a year.
So we have all of those in front of us?
You have all of them, yes. Those are, some of them were appealed, but the decision of the zoning administrator is the decision that was ultimately upheld.
And one of the objectives of the coordinating council is, as I understand it, is to remove the zoning administrators, change the process so it's no longer a single person's decision, it's 3 out
No,
of 5.
that really, they are going along with the draft option, except they want the supermajority. Again, as
They want
Hassan
4 out
have
of 5.
indicated, their first preference is ban use variances. But they are willing to let the zoning administrator, preferably, handle these renewals. That's their preferred position. Ban all new use variances. Well, that's essentially the position
Yeah, I mean, it's just
Commissioner
like,
Sheets has taken.
it's just like an appeal we would get, is or it's just like the process we're talking
Right.
about here, is the coordinating council's position is ban it all.
Except for the
Okay, well, if we
renewals.
don't get if we don't get that supermajority, and then, then the next step is what happens if they don't get that? And that's what we don't know about. How do they feel about the ZA being pulled out of the process?
Well, again, as we've had that discussion, and they do support and understand that some of these existing uses need to continue, and they would actually prefer the zoning administrator be the initial hearing body on
So
those.
this goes against their wishes.
No. Oh, the draft ordinance?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, because it doesn't provide for the supermajority,
And it takes the
and it takes the ZA out.
Right, so,
Right.
Doesn't go against, it falls short in terms of their wishes.
well, that's fine. That's a much better way of saying it. They don't get everything they would like. And in this case, anyway. But again, so it's almost like the negotiation process we go through with variances or conditional uses, where things change. So what I'm saying is, no one knows, and in fact, this may go totally against what an organization like the Homeowners Coordinating Council would want to do. They may be totally against removing the ZA from the process, and yet this is what you're doing. Basically, you said, no, you're not going to get a total elimination of use ordinances, and no, you're not even going to get supermajority, and to top it off, we're going to remove the ZA from the process and really, stick it to what you want. I mean, maybe I've got their intent wrong, but if I'm on the coordinating council, I'm going, well, like I've said already, I'm going for more public outreach rather than less. Now, if they disagree with me, I just want to hear it. So I can't support it. We've got 2 ways to go, gentlemen, and it's up to you guys to make the motions. We can vote on it, or we can table it.
Why not continue it to a date certain in mid-September? It gives the coordinating council 2 meetings and has enough time for them to mull over, and us to mull over.
It'll
everything.
actually give them 1 meeting. In fact, I'm not sure they meet in September. I know they don't meet July, August.
Oh, they don't meet August 4th?
I don't believe so.
How about, let's say, the first or the second meeting in October?
Well, that's where I was originally going if we were going to go date certain. And I don't have a problem with date certain because it means we're actually going to do something about it. That's fine.
Well, then,
Here we go on. Right.
Was that a motion?
oh yeah, Gary will be gone too. Wonder if he's not here anyway.
If there's a motion, I'll second it.
Yeah, now, point of order, if we continue this and we have different people on the commission, it's just a new, it's not an issue with.
No decision.
Oh, they
Just
can
making sure,
Yeah,
making
yeah.
sure.
It was
That is
a
a
statement
point,
of...
though.
Huh?
That is a point, maybe, Mr.
Me and Joe will be gone.
We can send a DVD copy to...
No, the problem is if we have different people, it isn't that a decision can't be made, it's that you've got different people completely in the discussion.
We have 2 more,
Perspectives.
the 3 of us will be here, and you'll have 2 more new people in October.
That's something to consider, too, no matter what we do.
Don't have questions.
Have questions.
Deja vu all over again.
Do we have a motion? Okay.
Not sure, I
I
was,
was waiting for Mr.
We
King to
don't
ask for
have,
one.
I did
checking on
ask for one.
dates.
Oh,
There was
I
one.
said, tell me which way you want to move, and
the
but we were
dates-
looking for a date.
The first meeting in October, the first Wednesday in October will be the 1st of October, and the third Wednesday in October would be October 15.
October 15th, the Ides of October. Now, however, we're about to do something, and we've got enough time to correct it. We're going to need to find out procedurally that we've had 4 people here, we're about to continue something, and one of the we're going to have 2 new people at that hearing. So I don't know procedurally whether we just re-advertise and it comes up afresh, or whether it's continued, whether it's considered continuation. I don't know these things.
Not a problem.
It's not a problem? Much ado about nothing? All right. I'm continuing the Shakespeare quotes.
No.
because this isn't a quasi-judicial case, this is...
So we can do that with no issue.
Recommendation.
Fine, all right.
It's just a question of, is that what you want to do if you lose Mr. Manukian?
Yeah, it is. We'll miss him, but I think it's what we want to do.
well, Mr. Chairman, I would like to move that we continue this to a date certain to October 15th, 2008.
Correctly, you would actually like us to share our report and analysis with the homeowners coordinating council so that they can actually think through this as well and get their feedback and pass on their feedback to you.
Yeah, I'm
Just
most
a quick
interested.
question. Earlier in the discussion, we heard,
And I second it.
well, you already seconded?
Well, we can, yeah,
Well,
he can
I'm sorry.
second, we can still have discussion.
Yeah, the outreach that I would prefer would be one to not just the homeowners coordinating council, but as you mentioned earlier, a lot of these things come from businesses. Is there any way that we could possibly involve the, I don't know, Chamber of Commerce or?
The realtors,
I think the only way that we can perhaps capture some of those infrequent, once-in-a-while applicants is to contact some of the people who tend to represent applicants once in a while, so that...
We would have Shorik Yepremian, Rodney Kahn?
Yeah.
At least,
Right.
because they represent a
Oh, yeah.
majority of these.
So, yes, and some of the brokers in town who actually tend, we'll contact the frequent applicants.
the usual suspects?
Yeah, okay. That's all I wanted. It has no effect on the second
No,
motion.
thank you for clarifying that. When we're talking about outreach, for anybody that you consider to be interested.
Really reaching.
All right, we have a motion, we have
Yes, second.
support. No further discussion, seeing none, please call roll.
Commissioner Schitz.
Aye.
Commissioner Torgerson.
Aye.
Commissioner Manukin.
Aye.
And Chair Kane.
Aye, and a vote of 4-0, zoning code amendment case PZON 2008-003, related to use variances, is continued to October 15th, 2008, with no further notice being necessary. All right. Any new business? I see none on the agenda. Planning Department updates?
No.
Comments from commissioners?
No.
I have one. What's happening with our Glendale becoming green LEED certification type of process? It's been 2 weeks.
And the direction is getting larger and more comprehensive. I think we need to get several other departments involved because based on the latest interest that we've heard from the City Council, what we first started discussing as simply green buildings and architectural and design ideas, I think is turning into a much larger interest on part of the city to take a more comprehensive look. What's happening is that we're collaborating with other departments, and we're going to perhaps come up with a more comprehensive approach, and we'll give you an update as soon as we have some. It's
Okay.
getting bigger.
I mean, that's great that there's more interest than less, but what that's just done is you've just increased the size of the committee, so to speak, and the process will now stop. It will take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years to get everybody together. So, and that's fine. If that's the way the city wants to go, that's fine. But I sure hope that you, as the Director of Planning, make it known to council what the impact is, that they will be, in effect, dead in the water for an extended period of time because of the expansion of the process. It's all good to expand it, but because of it, now it's going to become more and more and more complex, and if we think we have any chance of moving this ship we need to do it with less ballast. That's all. Any other comments? All right. Entertain a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn?
We are adjourned.